Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another NWC Youth Live BFG lesson. Really good to be back with you all again this week. Before we get jumping into this lesson though, do want to give you a heads up that we have another parents meeting video online. I think it's round about 8 minutes long, and it contains all our updates on our new weekly schedule, on camps, and on Senior Recognition Sunday. And so I would encourage you guys, if you haven't seen that already, to go ahead and check that out. That will have a lot of good info on just what's going on in the youth right now. I will do a recap, though, of our new schedule because I want to make sure everybody's aware of this. We are changing up how we're doing our weekly routine with the Zoom calls. And in the parents meeting video, I go into a little more detail onto the rationale behind this. So here, I'm just going to recap what the new schedule will look like. We now have 3 Zoom meetings during the week. One is Sundays at 3 p.m. is our high school BFG time. That is the same as it was before. That's staying consistent. What is changing is now our middle school will meet at 4 p.m. on Sundays for their BFG time. And then we're condensing our midweek gathering down to just one time slot. That'll be Wednesdays at 4 p.m. for both high school and middle school. We'll all get together on the front end. However, we'll keep our breakout groups and things like that, so the students won't all be together the whole time. We will have separate groups for high school and middle school and things like that. So do check out that video if you haven't already, and make sure you get all those updates. Moving on though to our lesson, so we are continuing to crank through the book of 1 Samuel, and I know we took a week off, so I'll just do a brief recap of what happened last time. You'll recall that Samuel was asked by the people to find them a king. And at first, Samuel was not happy about this, and God said, hey, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, but go ahead, give them what they want, give them a king like the pagan nations around them. So Samuel finds this guy named Saul, makes him king, and then last week we saw what kind of king Saul was, and he was not a good one. Saul routinely disobeyed the Lord and showed that he was unwilling to fully submit to God's authority and plan. And so God said, I am rejecting you as king. You're no longer going to be king. And that it wasn't an immediate switch that happened, but then there was this period of delay. And so we pick up in chapters 16 and 17 this week. And what's going on here, I won't read all of 16 and 17, but just to kind of give you guys a bit of context before we jump into our first passage, Samuel is mourning the fact that Saul has been rejected by the Lord. He had great hopes for Saul and his kingdom, and it's breaking his heart that now the kingdom's going to have to go through this rough time of Saul being rejected as king and more turmoil and overturn. And in the midst of that, God comes to Samuel and says, stop mourning the loss of Saul and go to this town called Bethlehem, find a man named Jesse, and I am going to tell you which of his sons I have selected as king. So Saul gets up, dusts himself off, and he goes to Bethlehem. He finds the man named Jesse, and he tells Jesse what's going on, that God has said one of his sons is going to be king. So Jesse brings in his sons. He parades them in front of Samuel one by one, and one by one, God tells Samuel, that's not him, that's not him, that's not him, until the room is full and none of his sons have been selected. So now Samuel's getting a little concerned, and we pick up right after God has told Samuel that the last son in the room is not to be king. This is what Samuel says to Jesse. Chapter 16, verse 11. Samuel asked him, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, he answered, but right now he's tending the sheep. Samuel told Jesse, send for him. We won't sit down to eat until he gets here. So Jesse sends for his youngest son named David. David comes, he presents himself to Samuel, and in that moment, God says to Samuel, "That's the one. That is the one I've selected as king." But notice something rather interesting about this story, this narrative, this occurrence in history, that David was not invited to the initial selection process. And I think it's fair for us to just pause and ask, well, why wouldn't David be selected? Samuel told Jesse, one of your sons will be king. So Jesse brings in all his sons but one, his very youngest. And I think what's meant to be communicated there is that David was being overlooked as a possible candidate for king. That is, Jesse and his brothers just assumed from the onset that David wasn't the type of guy that could be selected by God as king. That of all the people God might want, surely David wasn't one of them. And in fact, as we continue on through these next two chapters, that becomes a reoccurring theme. It's not just this one time that happens to David. It actually happens over and over again, that he continually gets overlooked. So just to kind of run us through what's happening in the next little while, Samuel is told by God, David is my anointed. That's the one I'm going to make king someday. So Samuel anoints David. He goes through this special ceremony where the prophet recognizes the future king as God's select king, just as he had done before with Saul. So David goes through this process, Samuel leaves, and then in kind of this weird twist of things, David enters the service of Saul as a musician. Saul is being plagued by this demon. He's having terrible torments, and it's just really rough nights for him. And so David comes and begins to play music, which for whatever reason soothes Saul. And then after that, sometime after David enters Saul's service, the Philistines come and attack. You'll recall that during this time period of Saul's reign, the Philistines and Israel are constantly battling. So the Philistines come, they enter Israel's territory, they set up camp. Israel comes with their army to meet them. And who goes to the battle with Saul? David's three oldest brothers, but not David. David wasn't considered to be a viable candidate for a warrior in this coming battle. And then, as I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, out of the Philistine camp comes this massive man named Goliath, who just towers above everybody else, and he challenges Israel to send a champion of their own, and the two of them will do combat one-on-one, and the victor of that will determine the victor of the battle. And this seems to have been a common practice in that day and age. And you can kind of see the rationale behind it. That two armies meeting face to face with swords and shields know that if they rush against each other, many people are going to die. Many people are going to be wounded, and that's not really desirable for anybody. And so instead, what they would do from time to time is, rather than have everybody in both army run at each other and start hacking away, they would just pick their two best warriors. Those two warriors would fight, and whoever was left standing at the end of that fight would determine the victor of the battle. But it's a pro-con situation. The pro is not as many people die. The con is, if you're going to do that, you have to be quite certain that your champion is going to win, or at least has a good shot of winning. Well, for the Philistines, that was easy. Goliath's bigger than everybody. Goliath's stronger than everybody. Goliath's got more battle experience than hardly anybody, and so they are very happy to send him in. But as many of you will know, Israel can't find a man, not even Saul, willing to meet Goliath's challenge. That is, until David, who wasn't invited to the war in the first place, comes and says, I will do battle with Goliath. And you know what I find interesting is, after David makes this offer to do battle with Goliath, and Saul agrees and says, okay, go and do your thing, We read this verse of Saul conferring with an advisor as David is going to meet Goliath. In chapter 17, verse 55, we read this: When Saul had seen David going out to confront the Philistine, that is Goliath, he asked Abner, the commander of the army, "Whose son is this youth, Abner?" "Your Majesty, as surely as you live, I do not know," Abner replied. What's shocking is just one chapter earlier, you know what Saul was explicitly told? Who David was, who David's father was, what David's skills were as a musician, because Saul had asked David to enter his service and play for him to relieve this demonic torment from his mind. And yet, apparently, Saul had placed such a little value on David that he didn't even remember who he was as David went to meet Goliath. And maybe some of you have had experiences like this, where you run across somebody that you've met before. You said, hey, it's me, Drew. Good to see you again. And they look back at you with a blank stare, and they say something like, "I'm sorry, have we met before? Do I know you?" And if you've ever been in a moment like that, it doesn't feel great, because what seems to be occurring in that moment is that the other person placed such a little value on your initial meeting with them that they don't even remember who you are. And apparently, Saul had done the same thing with David. And you notice that theme with David's life. All his brothers are brought before Samuel because they're considered viable candidates to be king. But David is left out because it was just assumed he couldn't be king. His three oldest brothers go to war to meet the Philistines, but David's not invited because it's just assumed David doesn't have what it takes to be a warrior. And then David enters the service of Saul, but Saul places such a little value on him that when David goes to meet Goliath, even though David has been serving Saul for some time, Saul can't seem to remember who he is or who his parents are, where he comes from. And this is really the first big observation of the passage, that no one esteemed David a worthy candidate for king. That is, over and over again, people made clear that David was not one they valued as a viable candidate for king. And we might ask, why is that? Well, to help illustrate what I think is going on here, not too long ago, my wife and I were cleaning out some of our stuff. We were going into the storage room and some of the other rooms in our house and just getting rid of things we didn't need. And while we were doing this, we had two piles. One was the give to Goodwill pile, and the other was a trash can. And the reason some things went in the trash can rather than the Goodwill pile is we looked at it and we said, no one will ever want this. In other words, we had a certain standard in our mind, a standard of what a valuable item was. And if something fell below that standard, it just went in the trash. Likewise, the people of Israel had a standard in mind, a standard of what a king and a warrior looked like. And David fell below that standard. And so no one esteemed him a worthy candidate for king. So that is the people's perspective on David. But now I want us to shift things and instead take a look at David's perspective. And probably the best passage that illustrates David's heart and his mind is David's words to Goliath right before they engage in combat. So you recall, Goliath comes out and says, "Send me a warrior. We'll do combat, and whoever wins our combat will be the victor this day." No one in Israel's camp will do it, but David comes and says, "I'm going to do it. I will go and fight him." Saul agrees. So David goes out, and then as he's approaching Goliath, like you do, there's some banter back and forth, and Goliath says some rather unkind things to David, and then David replies with this. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, But I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today, the Lord will hand you over to me. Today, I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpse of the Philistine camps to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us. So those are obviously very bold words. And I think what they display is David's complete and total trust in God's faithfulness and God's ability to give him victory. Maybe some of you have gone through this exercise called a trust fall before. If you hadn't, it's a pretty simple exercise. You partner up with two people. One person stands behind the other, and then this person is supposed to just fall backwards and expect that the other person's going to catch them and keep them from falling to the ground. Truth be told, I don't have particularly high regards for this exercise. I don't know that I've ever walked away with greater trust in another individual because they caught me in a trust fall exercise. In fact, truth be told, the only reason I do the exercise is I just accept on the front end that I'm probably going to hit the ground. And then if they catch me, great. If they don't, I went into it with my eyes open. Tell you what I would respect, though, is a trust fall exercise over a cliffside. So say we're just lined up on the edge of a cliff right here. Somebody else is standing off to the side. And we say, you fall backwards, tilt over the side, and this person's going to catch you underneath and keep you from tipping over. That would take real trust. That would take real confidence in the other person's ability, because if that person fails, you die. And that's more what's happening with David here. This is not some camp-based trust fall where the greatest risk is you're going to fall 4 or 5 feet to the ground. This is a trust fall over a cliff, because David's not an idiot. David can look at Goliath and see he is a monster of a man. And by all human reason and by the normal functioning laws of physics, David has every reason to expect when he goes into that battle, he will die. But David goes in with confidence and boldness, the kind of boldness to even trash talk the Philistine he's about to do battle with, because he has complete confidence that God can and will give him the victory. And here's the ironic twist in the passage. No one judged David a worthy candidate for king. And David was the only one that judged God as worthy and competent and faithful. And at the end of the day, that was why God selected David as king. So here's the second big takeaway. God selected David as king because David esteemed God as above all. God selected David as king because David esteemed God as above all. No one else thought David was a worthy candidate for king except God himself. And God selected David as a worthy candidate for king precisely because David was the only one who looked to God with trust and belief and reliance. And here's what I think we can take away from the passage today then. God esteems those with kingdom virtues, not those with worldly virtues. God esteems those with kingdom virtues, not worldly virtues. You know, as we said before, a central theme in this passage is God's rebuke of the nation of Israel for selecting and evaluating their leaders on the basis of the standards of pagan nations That as pagan nations looked for people that were physically impressive to be their leaders and their warriors, people with great stature, people with great intellect. And in fact, you see that same standard being applied when Saul is selected. Read in 1 Samuel 9, verse 2, when Saul is being presented for the first time, here's how he's described. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man. There was no one more impressive among the Israelites than he. He stood a head taller than anyone else. In other words, what this passage is saying in context is that the people wanted Saul as their king because Saul was the most physically impressive specimen in the nation of Israel. And the people thought, oh, a guy who looks like that must be a mighty warrior. A guy who looks like that is going to lead our armies well. They put their trust in the might of Saul, which worked well until Saul was no longer the biggest guy in the room. And that's exactly what happened when Goliath walked on that battlefield, and Israel crumbled as a result. You see, Saul met the standards. He was virtuous by the standards of the world. But that's not what God was looking for. God wanted someone who, while they may have been lacking in the physical department, made up for it all the more in their trust and belief and confidence and devotion in him. God had all the power he needed to win his battles and to accomplish his goals. What he was looking for was leaders who had enough faith in him to do as he instructed, which was not the case with Saul. And you know what happened with Saul and David, really, it happens today very frequently. It is very often the case that we select leaders in our churches based upon criteria like whether or not they're good preachers or teachers. They have big visions. They've got charismatic personalities. They're go-getters. They get things done. They're very knowledgeable, intelligent, and when they speak, they sound like they know what's going on. And we assume that if they have those qualities, then they must be good leaders. You know, this reminds me of a story of a tragic example of this that happened some 10 years ago. And I'll leave the individual's name out, but you could probably easily find out who it is, and some of you may be even aware of who I'm talking about. But this individual was a pastor, and he had built a national church network that included hundreds of churches. He had taken the church he was pastoring from being a church that, to be honest, I don't remember their initial attendance now, but I do know that at its peak, they were at about 14,000 people every week attending the church in multiple different locations. Not only that, but this pastor, he became a best-selling author, had multiple book credits to his name. He was considered to be a gifted writer, a gifted speaker, a go-getter, someone with vision, someone that got things done for the kingdom of God. But you know what nobody saw? In all the years that he was climbing the ranks, and all the years that he was building his church and building this church network and publishing books, you know what nobody ever saw? Was the fact that he was an aggressive and condescending and angry leader. And when it finally came out that despite all his gifts, that was his heart, the church network he had built, they kicked him out. He was forced to resign from the church he was pastoring, with the result that church has since pretty well collapsed and crumbled. And I tell that story as an illustration of applying the wrong standards in our day and age for the selection of leaders. It's good to find someone that has gifts of teaching and preaching and things like that, but all the more important is finding someone with a heart devoted to the Lord's. And so here's two final takeaways then from this passage today that I think we can take and chew on and apply into our lives. Most of us just by the nature of things, do not end up in direct leadership roles in a church. However, all of us, at least in Southern Baptist circles, are involved in the selection of our leaders. And that means we need to be aware of what makes for a good leader. And I think it is important to take away from this passage today the truth that what makes for a good leader in the kingdom of God is not first and foremost somebody who has a lot of external giftings, like being a good speaker and a charismatic person and very intelligent and a go-getter and a lot of drive. The most important characteristics of a leader in the kingdom of God are that the person loved the Lord and they love others. And that is manifested in somebody who has a gentle humility and a servant's heart. You want to find a good leader, pick someone that is a servant, pick someone that loves others, and pick them even if they're a worse teacher and worse speaker than the other person up for the job. Second takeaway is, while God may give different gifts to different people, what matters more is how we use those gifts in love and service. That is, God doesn't give everybody the gift of being a great teacher or speaker. God doesn't give everybody the gift of being charismatic and one of those magnetic personalities. God doesn't give everybody the gift of being a massive intellectual. But vastly more important than the specific gift God has given you is whether you use that gift in pursuit of loving and serving your brothers and sisters in Christ and in pursuit of the glory of God, versus building up your own name and building up your own kingdom and using the gifts God has given you not for the love of others but for the love of yourself. Love always trumps gifting in the end. Thanks for joining me. Look forward to discussing this passage with you all in some of our Zoom chats later on today. Thanks.